About the only encouraging thing I heard in William Scott's talk a minute ago was that there was more than 6 hours to World War III coming up. I've been asked to speak a little bit about transnational organized crime, which tries to capture, I think, General Hayden's comments about some people being sinners, and maybe tries to morph a little bit of Jim Woolsey's statement that our enemies are the rich. But in this case, these are people enriched not from oil necessarily, but principally from drugs and, of course, things like human trafficking. The point of my talk really is less about organized crime, which presents common public issues of safety, and more about the seem uniform and acceptable dynamic, which is the convergence of organized crime with terrorism and acts of insurgency. No lesser light than Director Clapper recently testified that transnational organized crime, particularly in the Islamic Maghreb, is the abiding threat to national security in the United States. And in fact, when you go back and you take a look at the National Intelligence Council's open source global trend documents, they're really quite consistent and repeated in the warning or prediction that what we're facing in the world to come between now and 2025 is the growing emergence of non-state actors, a multipolar world without the benefits, if you will, of multilateralism, and a discord of demographics, all of which is a toxic mixture for exploitation by organized crime, and particularly cross-border exploitation of organized crime. Now, what is the threat that transnational organized crime poses to national security? The first I've already mentioned, and is pretty much straightforward. It's our common public safety, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, kidnapping, intimidation and extortion, murder now on a scale that we haven't witnessed except in theaters of conflict when you think about what's happening south of the Mexican border today. Counterfeiting and the kind of cyber fraud capability of stealing your identity or emptying your bank accounts, all of these threaten our common good. All of these are rather unrevealing, obvious challenges of organized crime. But there's a second growing theater of threat that's more far-reaching and presents kind of an uncommon injury, if you will, to our national security. And that is this, what I referred to before, as the convergence or the unholy alliance of crime, terror, and insurgency. It affects us in our national security in a number of different ways. The first is the corruption of developing states. The second is capture of failing states. The third is alliances by trans-organized criminal organizations with state sponsors of terrorism. The fourth is this convergence that I've referred to you of the terrorism, crime, and insurgency, which reflects, in some cases, not so much a shared ideology, although I'll give you an example where there is a shared ideology in a second, and more so merely marriages of convenience, where crime, violence, and extortion can make both parties rich or further the political ends of terrorists. By the way, when I was at Treasury, it was immediately after 9/11, and we had to stand up what was a nascent terrorist financing organization trying to trace the source of monies. We believed at the time, and I think we were correct at the time, that the principal source of money for terrorism through a rather centralized al-Qaeda organization were the diversion of charitable funds and or direct contributions, knowing contributions from people in the Middle East. We got very good at chasing that money, extremely good at that chasing that money. And if you will, terrorists responded by seeking out other sources of money. And the other sources of money that they turned to increasingly in a balkanized, atomized world was plain old pedestrian crime. So when you looked at what happened in Madrid several years ago, close inspection proved that Madrid was not financed by international money. Madrid was a locally financed drug operation and also smuggling of people across the straits there from Morocco, financed by crime and financed by the organized criminal elements of Spain that killed scores and scores of people. So increasingly, terrorist financing concerns have focused upon the growing alliance between the funding of the terrorist activities by crime and indeed the attraction, the marquee attraction of maximizing that and leveraging it by reaching out and shaking hands with transnational organized crime. None of this is really imagined, and you have to appreciate the scope to appreciate that this is real. This is a real, current, abiding, corrosive, constant threat. It may not have the immediacy, it may not have the marquee value of talking about cyber warfare or about even fires set out in California and Arizona, but it is a constant eroding drip which actually has the capability of bringing weapons of mass destruction to our borders. There's a very interesting piece of testimony people ought to read by Douglas Farah about 2 or 3 months ago here in the Senate on the incredibly tight alliance of Iran and the Quds forces and the Iranian Guard and FARC and the government of Chavez, and what they're standing up there, including military universities and including, quite frankly, the building or the ambition to build a nuclear plant, which is the same blueprint as the plant in Iran that has been bedeviling us now for more than 7 years. But back to the scope. You know, these numbers are imperfect, and the reason the numbers are imperfect is by definition, this is clandestine activity. This is hidden markets. This is black, dark pool money. Ironically, the anonymity of the money has additional protections by how modern a system we have now for the transfer of wealth across borders today. I don't know whether it was Michael or Jim who referred to it, but we now transfer money not less in bulk and more in X's and O's. And X's and O's sometimes are easy to follow if you have penetrate a system, like we once upon did, now publicly known, called SWIFT. But otherwise, very difficult to figure out who is sending what to whom when it's a digital transfer of huge amounts of money across borders, frequently hidden as false transactions and trade activity. Size, though, even with all those caveats. The White House's numbers in their announcement of the July 2011 strategy on transnational crime. $1 to $3 trillion in laundered accounts. $1 billion in public official bribery. $750 to $1 trillion, $750 billion to $1 trillion in drug money. Illicit weaponry sales, 170 to 320 billion. Counterfeited and pirated goods, 500 billion. Those numbers add up, if my arithmetic is right, to $6.2 billion. At the high side, the equivalent of 10% of GDP in the US. Now, World Bank estimates put it lower, but whether it's 4% or 10%, it's still a staggering amount of money. And that money is used to corrupt states and failing states, to buy safe haven, and to help both illicit activity and terrorist activity. Disorder favors the bad guys, the sinners that Michael was referring to. Who are these guys? Well, in Russia and Eurasia, they now go by a newly dubbed name, the Brothers Circle. In India, there's a guy named Dawood Ibrahim, who I'll speak more about, and the D Company. In Latin America, there are many cartels that you're familiar with, but the most savage and gory one is Los Cetas. In Italy, it's the Camorra. In Japan, it's one of the Yakuza crime families, the most prominent of which was recently designated by Treasury. I'm going to butcher the name, but Yamaguchi Gumi is what the name of the family is. The trade is commonplace, counterfeiting, human chattel, illicit arms trade, fraud, and above all, drugs. They use shell companies, compromise accountants, lawyers, bankers, and investment bankers, but most importantly, they corrupt public officials as they ply the trade. And perhaps more importantly, they spirit the money that they earn locally across the globe to expand their criminal enterprise. Now, these organizations, the five I named by way of example, which have been named by the Treasury Department, this isn't, Marlon Brando hierarchy, old world cartels. These are very complex, networked, loosely knit together criminal syndicate families and clans and tribes. They are allied because of the convenience of it, and they're allied, unfortunately, this is the dark side of the internet, of course, by the ease with which you can communicate, engage in social intercourse, engage in criminal intercourse, and transfer funds and logistics necessary to become a global criminal enterprise. Let me give you some examples. And I'm giving you these examples to impress upon you that there is no one model for the crime family, and there's no one model for the nexus that I'm concerned about, and that actually the current administration, which has been really, really on top of this, the nexus between terrorism and transnational organized crime. There's no single model. Some are marriages of convenience, some are revolutionary fronts that have morphed to commercial criminal enterprises, and some are criminal enterprises that have morphed to revolutionary fronts. Afghanistan is the most obvious up front for all of us. The alliance with criminal networks like the Haqqani networks, who are basically responsible for many of the IED deaths that we've encountered in Afghanistan, and for the corruption of the officials, and thereby undermining the legitimacy and the capacity of the government that we're trying to stand up there. The Afghanistan exercise, however, pales in terms of its sagacity, in terms of its footprint to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been around for years and years and years. It is now confirmed through indictments, through designations, and through intelligence that it's a major drug trafficking and money laundering organization, as well as a terrorist organization. And its reach goes from the tri-border area down in Latin America and alliances with the FARC up in the north of Latin America to West Africa and captured or near captured nations like Mali or Guinea-Bissau, and money flowing through Lebanese banks, all of which became disclosed and all of which was seriously shut down or frustrated by the efforts of the U.S. government in the closing of what was known as the Lebanese Canadian Bank. Hezbollah's activities, there's such a long history of Hezbollah's activities in Latin America alone that it's frightening to think about. And it's all allied with the drug trade in terms of underwriting. It goes back to 1994 and the bombing of the AMIA Buenos Aires Jewish Center, which directly implicated Hezbollah and Iran. It advances as much as early or as late to December 2001, when Aman Jumaih, a Lebanese drug kingpin and Hezbollah financier, was charged with smuggling tons of U.S.-bound cocaine in concert with the Los Zetas Mexican organized crime cartel. And then you hear, at least from open source materials, I mention this almost because it sounds like Keystone Cops, is the quixotic open source story that the Quad Iranian Revolutionary Guard allied themselves with hitmen of Los Zetas, to go after the ambassador from Saudi Arabia here in America. Gentlemen on this table may know sources that I don't have available to me. It's both stunning in its stupidity, stunning in its ambition, frightening if it does represent a willingness to kill in America through an alliance of organized crime and terrorist political activity. There's less tilting at windmills if you turn east and return to what I mentioned about a different organization, the D Company, which is in India and Pakistan. This is a criminal group that's actually transformed itself from 20 years of being the most powerful criminal network in India and Pakistan to becoming the champion of terrorist activity in the area, with direct ties and responsibility to the Mumbai bombings. Congressional reports have called this a fusion company, that is, crime and terror, that numbers 5,000 people in Pakistan, India, and the UAE. It was designated originally as a global terrorist organization in 2003, but then graduated, if you will, to being designated in 2006 also as a drug kingpin operation. Its core products are extortion, smuggling, narcotics, and contract killing. It was overseen by Mr. Ibrahim throughout the 90s and became and morphed into a politically purposeful, designed criminal organization after the destruction of the Babri Mosque in Pradesh in the 1990s. That's a criminal organization that morphed into a criminal organization whose money sponsors terrorist activity. FARC is a different story. FARC was always a terrorist organization, which over time, after it was awarded 42,000 hectares of territory in an attempt by the Colombian government to assuage them and to buy some level of peace, then started promoting a drug trade which finances them today and finances the havoc that they continue to reap down in the Latin America area. So while the old cartels that we used to read about, like the Cali cartel, seem to have been crushed. The one cartel that hasn't been crushed is FARC, and FARC continues today with close alliances to Iran. And on that point, instead of either plagiarizing or taking more time, I really recommend that you read Doug Farah's testimony of about 3 months ago on Iran's presence in Latin America and the direct national security threat it poses in its alliance with the drug trade in Latin America. Let me give you a couple of conclusions or observations. The scope, as I said, of this threat is incredibly large. It's almost unimaginable. This is more resources devoted to violence than any other non-state source. It's growing. It's growing exponentially. It undermines our international development aid. There are lots of numbers out there, but substantial, I've read substantial numbers to suggest that 30 or 40% of development aid gets in the wrong pockets, gets diverted. It goes to corrupt public officials who then harbor the activity of organized crime and terrorist activity. As I said, it threatens to bring disorder to the failing states. There is a growing literature that they're getting smart about what they do with their investments. And the smartness is to leverage their power by becoming significant forces in strategic materials and natural resources, thereby giving them leverage in those markets and thereby distorting those markets, much to our economic disadvantage. I want to leave you with one large irony about this convergence. In a world of asymmetrical warfare, and that's what this is, leverage risk from the non-state actors depends in part upon their ability to ally themselves as networks. What we have found, and what my friends and colleagues from my days at Treasury have found, ironically, is that one of the most powerful weapons against these networks is to shame them, to pick out a node in the network, to name them, to out them, to do, it's one thing to say they're going to freeze their assets. Most of these networks don't have material assets in the U.S. to freeze. It's another thing to prohibit trade with them. Most U.S. legitimate businesses wouldn't be trading with them anyway. It's another thing simply to name them and brand them and put the scarlet letter on them. The success that flows from that has two reasons. One is legitimate businesses will certainly shun companies. The second is their former allies in the illegitimate business are frightened of enhanced scrutiny. And so they may shy away from the alliances that they formerly had with these networks. And so the U.S. government strategy right now is to try to take down the networks by outing each individual node that's identifiable in the network. And it's actually quite a smart way to go about it. It is not a top-down, but a bottom-up erosion of their powers. If you don't break that circuitry, what's promised over the next 20 years is an enormous amount of civil disorder around the world, and the prospect of an acceleration of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction at your doors.